This
the
conference
members.
will now be recorded.
Okay, so it has been started. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our study group meeting, practical implementation on standards of internal audit. I request Gaurav Mishra to kindly introduce our today's faculty, Mr. Sachin Shah. Thank you, Gaurav. Over to you. Thank you so much. Gaurav, you can
Thank
introduce
you,
this.
thank you, Bhavin Bhai. So, good evening, everyone, and wish you all happy Makar Sankranti. So, today's session is, I think that yes, today's session is going to be very fantastic because it's a, I can relate with my experience, and I know a lot of people who joined here that a lot of people are into internal audit practice. And Sachin is going to take this particular session with his vast experience. So, Sachin, good evening, Sachin. So Sachin is a postgraduate from Narsi Munji College, and he is having around 13 years of experience to serve the domestic client as well as international client. And he is into the risk advisory services, internal audit, supply chain management, SOX, and IFC assignments. And right now, he is associated with the Protivity India as a director into the business risk advisory practice. So prior to joining the Protivity, he was with MM Group and Genpact, which is obviously they are the pioneer in their own field. So I think with the experience of Sachin, we can gain a lot. So thank you, Sachin, for your availability on today's session. And again, once again, good evening to you.
Thanks, Gaurav, and would like to thank WRC for giving me this opportunity to share my experience on standards on internal audit and some of the practical applications or insights and how to do an effective internal audit. So I have a small presentation, so I'll just share my screen. Let me know once the screen is visible.
Yeah, is it? It is visible now.
Okay, just a second. Okay, so so before we move on to standards on internal audit, let's spend a couple of minutes on understanding as to why internal audit is important and what value internal audit brings. Like why is internal audit required in any organization? So let's understand the definition of internal audit. Internal audit is basically an activity which provides assurance to the management on the effectiveness of the internal controls and to ensure that the internal controls are aligned to the organizational objectives, to the achievement of the organizational objectives. So that's what internal audit does. So that's a definition institute issued by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. And I'm sure everyone understands, when we say about assurance, most important is it provides an independent assurance. So the management and the organization heavily relies on internal audit depending on the maturity and size and scale of individual organizations in providing assurance on effectiveness of internal controls. Now, with this, why do we need standards on internal audit? Because when we provide an assurance, each person can rely on his or her own experience. Now, the reason why we need standards is to bring in consistency in delivery of internal audit and to ensure the outcomes out of the internal audit exercise are consistent, are in a consistent manner, and with desired quality results which are there. And hence, the standards have been implemented by the ICAI, and this has been instituted in 2004, and since then there have been a lot of revisions in the standards as well, depending on how the internal audit execution or internal audit development has happened. For example, ERM, data analytics, a lot of standards have been coming up new and also getting revised over a period of time. So we'll have a look at the standards, and I would try to focus on sharing more in terms of practical insights. So would not read the standards. This presentation would be available to you. I'll share it with Bhavin, and this would be available to you. But what I would try to do is bring out more in terms of experience in delivering internal audit, and I have been presenting to the board of directors for last 7 to 8 years. So what I've been hearing from them and where do they see the importance of internal audit, and what are their expectations from the internal audit. Like, we do deliver good quality reports, but sometimes there is a gap in meeting their expectations. Now, what are those gaps? We'll try to cover in the multiple SIAs that we will look at today. Having said that, all these standards are recommendatory in nature. So it is not like a compliance where you have to necessarily follow, but these are recommended in nature, and almost all internal audit professionals, internal audit function are in compliance to these standards or adopting these standards in some or the other form. Now, whether they are doing it in an efficient manner is a different question, but definitely, as in when you look at the standards, even in your experience, you would have implemented most of this. But yes, there could be obviously in areas where you can do it in a more refined manner. And this is similar to, if you look at, let's say, COSO guidelines from an IFC perspective, etc. These are all guidelines and recommendatory in nature, which can be adopted. Now, I'm sure everyone would have heard about the standards. Let's look at certain intricacies of the standards, like how well do we know the standards. So overall, when we look at SIAs, these are broken down, into three series, as I would say, series, 100, 200, and 300 series that are there. The series 100 focuses largely on the key concepts of internal audit, like, in terms of what drives the internal audit, objective of internal audit, etc. So there are few standards, which falls under that umbrella. The second series, 200 series, is largely focusing on overall management of internal audit. So in terms of, internal audit function, how should the internal audit activities be governed, who is responsible for driving these activities, etc. And the standard 300 series largely focusing on how do we effectively execute an internal audit, how do we conduct an internal audit. So these are the three series that that has been developed, and within each series or each bucket there are multiple standards which have been implemented, which have been defined. Now first, let's look at the objective of internal audit, as we discussed a couple of minutes back. The sorry. Now, the objective of having an internal audit function in any organization is basically to meet organizational objectives and also, in achieving the expectations of the management. Now, to successfully conduct an internal audit engagement, a lot of organizations, or from a best practices perspective, do document an internal audit charter. So if you look at from a requirement perspective is, and this is done for a mid-size or large matured organizations which have implemented or at least have a sizable internal audit function in place, or even if they don't have an internal audit function, they do outsource, they do engage a consultants to develop the internal audit charter, which defines the rights, responsibilities, accountability, and reporting mechanism, sample size, etc. Everything. So everything, it's a manual which documents that how the internal audit activities will be governed. It also documents to a very good extent as to what, when we say roles and responsibilities of internal audit, because internal audit is a key driver which coordinates with, and it's a key pillar, it's a key governance pillar which coordinates with, let's say, your forensic function, with your IT function, with your operations, with supply chain management. So they have to draw a line as to what can internal audit do and what it cannot do. So the internal audit charter defines, what is their role in providing an assurance, what is their role in probably, let's say, a reviewing of policies and procedures, because it's a thin line. What is their role in terms of providing or undertaking consulting engagements. So large matured organizations, and slowly, a lot of other organizations are also starting to have or develop an internal audit charter or a manual. Now, this is something which is initiated by the internal audit function, approved by the board. Now, what happens is approved by the audit committee or board, or whichever is a higher authority. Now, what happens is it gives a direction to the entire organization on the internal audit, or the focus, why the internal audit is focused in the organization. So when it is approved by the senior management or the board, it gives a viewpoint that, this is where the management is serious about conducting an internal audit in an organization. So it gives a weightage to the internal audit function. Apart from it gives a direction, it gives a significant weightage to the internal audit function that this has been reviewed and approved by the board of directors. Having said that, again, as and when the organization matures, the internal audit function also evolves, and that's where there is a need or a necessity to review the internal audit charter on a periodic basis. Now this could be, there is a enhancement of internal audit function, maybe the internal audit function has implemented tools, technologies, maybe their role has changed over a period of time significantly, etc., and hence the internal audit engagement needs to be reviewed periodically. So that's the overall objective of internal audit function. And how does the chief internal auditor or the representative of internal auditor play a critical role? Some of the components of the internal audit charter is obviously the mission and vision. Why has the internal audit function being developed, implemented, or what's the rationale for the existence of the internal audit function? The objectives of internal audit, which we discussed: reporting structure and independency. Now this is very important. Whom doesn't, there is always a debate, discussions, best practice sharing, whom does an internal audit report? Since when we looked at the definition, it's an independent assurance, hence the reporting also has to be independent. So if you look at a lot of organizations where internal audit is a startup function or an evolving function, you would see in the initial days or the initial period, the internal audit reports to probably, let's say, a CFO or a CEO. But as and when the internal audit function matures or evolves over a period of time, as and when the organization grows, scales up larger, as a best practice, internal audit reporting should ideally be with the audit committee or the board of directors. So functional reporting has to be with the audit committee or a board of directors. However, operational reporting can be with the CEO or a CFO. So so from an independency perspective, I think it's an important component of a internal audit charter. The scope and approach, scope, as we discussed, where do internal audit function need to draw a line, what is the frequency within which they need to report to the internal audit function, etc. The accountability and authority, to what extent are internal audit held accountable, and how can and it's from a scorecard perspective as well. What are the internal audit scorecard dashboards, and how do we successfully measure the existence of the internal audit function? Responsibilities, what are the responsibilities? And also in terms of, if you look at a matured internal audit charter, it also talks about how has the internal audit function, or how will the internal audit function evolve within the organization over a period of time. If you look at the IIA standards, the standards issued by Institute of Internal Auditors, also does talk about whether the internal audit function is aligned to the IIA standards. Are there any gaps in place? So we'll cover some of those elements in subsequent standards. I think this is what we have already discussed. It has to be approved by the board of directors. It documents the rights, responsibilities. It also talks about the nature of assurance services that can be undertaken and nature of the consulting services, etc. To what extent internal audit function will have an access to records, data availability, etc. Everything gets captured in the internal audit charter. In my experience, in some of the matured organizations, and typically if you see this is a trend that you see outside India, where if there is any dispute with the auditee, normally a reference to the internal audit charter is given, that as an internal audit function we have a right to access to unlimited records, etc. So and that's where you would see internal audit charter being developed, is a mandatory document in most of the organizations outside India. Within India as well, large mid-sized to large organizations have documented in the internal audit charter formally, and probably a lot of other organizations would have documented it informally in discussions with the management. But this is something as an important document, important message, which goes from the board audit committee to the overall organization as to what was the roles and responsibilities of the internal audit charter. If there are any questions, please feel free to interrupt. I would be happy to answer it as and when we go ahead. We can also take it at the end of it, depending on your comfort. So once the internal audit charter is there, now how does a chief audit executive or the internal audit executive, go about doing an internal audit planning? So there is a huge focus on internal audit planning in a lot of organizations within India, or a small size and mid-sized organizations, as you would see. Generally, let's say if if you say internal audit plan for a manufacturing company, we will start or end with like basic 8 to 10 processes: procurement, inventory, production, supply chain, fixed assets, finance and accounts, HR, etc. So typically, a lot of organizations you would see 2 to 3 areas each quarter, and 10 to 12 audits in a year, which gets reported to the management. However, again, depending on the size, scale, complexity of the organizations, there's an internal audit planning exercise. The way the way organization has a budgeting exercise, which starts, let's say, somewhere between October, November, December, budget for the next year, which for January to December. Similarly, large mature organizations has an internal audit planning exercise to understand, and that starts with basically primarily a risk assessment. So it starts with, first of all, organizational mapping of the locations, plants, departments, etc. It starts with what is our existing infrastructure, existing structure, and basis that there is a risk assessment exercise which is done. So it is done in a comprehensive manner when a company is implementing the risk-based IA planning exercise, and every year it is revalidated. Or in the in this COVID scenario, and even in pre-COVID scenario, it has also been challenged whether the risk assessment needs to be done on an annual basis, or probably a quarterly or a half yearly basis, considering the complexities within which an organization operates. So there is an annual risk-based risk assessment planning exercise. We also call it a risk-based IA planning exercise. And basis that a risk, an internal audit. Hello.
Yeah. So once you complete it, I just wanted to ask few questions.
Okay, fair enough. So risk-based planning exercise. Now there might be, let's say, 30 departments in an organization, 20 departments, location complexity, cities, etc. So this risk-based IA planning exercise helps organization to define their focus areas as to which are those areas that we need to focus, probably on an annual basis, and probably once in 2 years, once in 3 years planning. So generally this risk assessment planning, risk-based IA planning is done for, let's say, a 2 years or a 3 years period, revalidated each year. The outcome of the risk assessment planning exercise is reported, or is submitted to the board of directors or the audit committee, and approval obtained from them, and basis that it is being rolled out, which will take the shape of an engagement planning, which we look at in the other SIs. Now, one of the important component which goes into a risk-based IA planning exercise is, if these are the risks that an organization is exposed to, whether does it fall under the internal audit framework, or it's a strategic risk which needs to be looked at in a different manner. If it falls in the internal audit framework, do we have adequate resources, skill sets, resources in terms of manpower availability, and also in terms of skills availability? Now when we say skills availability, technically talking about do we have IT? IT assessment or IT area will definitely be one of the critical areas from a risk-based assessment planning exercise. So do we have IT skill sets or IT auditors available in the team to perform an audit? Maybe there is a requirement of other technical skill sets also. For example, let's say from a production perspective, is there a production mechanical engineer who where we need to audit the production process? If for a real estate companies, do we have a civil engineer who can do justice in doing an audit for a project or a large capex investment, etc. So this exercise is extremely important from the perspective that the internal audit function can channelize their efforts in the right direction. So if you look at the trend that we have seen in last couple of years, specifically 4 to 5 years, if you do, let's say, a procurement audit, generally we used to cover vendor selection, evaluation, PR, PO, GRN, vendor advances, etc. Now when we discuss with clients, they are asking us to focus on specific areas. So for example, if there are no significant advances issued to vendors, if everything is under control, vendor advances is skipped out, vendor performance solutions probably skipped out. So the idea is, whatever 4 weeks you could spend in a procurement audit, now the organizations or the management is saying, boss, spend 2 weeks, but spend those efforts in the right direction so that your bandwidth increases and you can take up a large engagement, or you can take up multiple audits in a year. So that's where the importance of internal audit planning exercises. If you look at this image, this is what I just mentioned. If you look at all components of risk management like strategic, operational, financial compliance, you identify an audit universe, you rank it, basically what is high, medium, low, and then take all factors into consideration to create an internal audit plan. It could be a 1-year plan, 2-year plan, 3-year plan, depending size, skills, and complexity of the organization. Yes, sir. I think someone had a question related to the standard.
I only have a question, Sachin. So I just wanted to understand the risk register, what the organization prepares. So it is only basically the SIA is for an external auditor or an in-house internal auditor. So how it get coherence with the SIA and with the risk register, if you can throw lights in further with respect to the risk register and SIA.
Okay, so see, risk register is an document basis which the internal audit planning exercise is conducted. So it definitely has to be done by an in-house internal audit team, can be supported by an external consultant as well. So SIA will talk about more in terms of parameters that needs to be considered or taken care of when you are doing an internal audit planning exercise, in terms of scope, methodology, resources available, timing, extent, nature, etc. So risk register is a starting point or a document which is being leveraged to formulate an output of the internal audit plan for the coming year, let's say 2022-2023. And that's where as and when the organization is scaling up or the business scenario is changing, the risk register is bound to undergo revision or updation, maybe a 6 months or an annual exercise, depending on size, scale, complexity of the organization. So to answer your question, risk register is an input document which will help in arriving at an output in terms of the internal audit plan for the coming
Yeah, okay.
Moving on to the next SIA in terms of planning the internal audit assignment. Now this is where we are talking about the engagement planning. So we discussed risk IA planning exercise at the start of the year. Now let's say it is further broken down into quarters and into individual audits. So how do you go about planning an internal audit engagement? Now there are various steps, mechanism in place. Each organization has its own mechanism, depending on the focus areas. Some of the key steps that needs to be taken is, obviously, when you start or plan an internal audit engagement, you need to understand for the respective department. Obviously, at an organizational level, you need to have a clear understanding of the organization, and in specifically for the department, you need to sit and discuss with the department or functional HOD, understand the departmental KPIs, objectives, understand the critical control points, concern areas for that department, which will help you to focus or channelize your efforts in the right direction. You obviously leverage on the audit universe or the risk register, as was mentioned, for that particular department, because the risk register will talk about sub processes, sub activities, and what is critical, what is not critical, what are the existing controls in place. So you leverage whatever existing documentation that you have. Establishing the objective of the engagement, we discuss scoping. So scoping of the engagement in terms of, when you looked at a risk-based IA planning exercise, what is critical, what is not critical, and again linking it to the organizational KPIs, or sorry, departmental KPIs or KRAs, or some of the critical concern areas. We have discussed the resource allocation, because as in depending on engagement to engagement, we need to ensure we have the right resources in place from a skill set perspective, and documentation of an audit program. So audit program, now some organizations call it an audit program or a risk control metrics or a checkpoints or an RCSA. whatever shape or form it is important to have a holistic view of of the all the scope items, and against each scope items what are we planning to check and how are we planning to check. So that's a broad framework of how do you go about planning and engagement. Obviously there are reporting mechanisms involved, there are communication mechanisms involved, which there are other SIAs where we'll talk in a greater detail. So 300 series that I was talking about, but these are some of the basic steps as to you consider when you start your internal audit engagement planning. Some of the components, as I discussed, some of the components which you consider when you plan an engagement. A is an audit calendar. So when you meet with an HOD, he will obviously say, month ends are busy for me, let's say from a finance function, from a sales function, let's say year-end activities are there. So when you have a kickoff meeting or when you're planning engagement, you need to define the milestones very clearly as to whether it's a 4 weeks engagement, 6 weeks engagement, 8 weeks engagement, further broken down into individual milestones or the activities. In terms of fraud risk assessment, if there is an existing fraud risk indicators document available, as to how would you go about identifying a fraud risk indicators or a fraud risk governance mechanism. What is the methodology that you will deploy? What are the analytical procedures that you would take into consideration when you're doing an internal audit? So these are all scenarios, or these are all activities which you will document with the respective HODs or the auditee when you start it. From a communication protocol or a communication mechanism, you would report to the HODs or the senior management in the form of a weekly updates or a status updates, so that they are aware of where the internal audit progress, how the internal audit is progressing, and whether we are able to achieve the desired outcomes within the defined time frame. Control questionnaire is again in terms of checklist. What would be your sampling methodology is also that you communicate or you plan it or you consider in your planning exercise. Information requirement tracker is starting point, updated throughout the audit progress and also archived at the end of the audit, which can be leveraged in the subsequent or the futuristic audit. And the quality assurance review. Now the quality assurance review can be in the form of an in-house audit function. If you are outsourcing that function, then this would be done by the let's say the project managers, partners, directors, etc. So quality assurance review forms an important part, and which is in the form of, and that gets reflected in the form of a draft report and the final report. So these are some of the indicators of how do you plan the internal audit engagement. The next SIA is on managing the internal audit function. Some of these, we have covered in the subsequent slides, where now this is when you manage the internal audit function, or rather, and this is more in terms of from a internal audit executive chief internal audit executive perspective, that how does he ensure that the internal audit function is working in the best interest of the organization and aligned to the internal audit charter that we have documented. So some of the basic principles, and when you look at IA standards or SIAs and other standards as well, talks about that the internal audit should adhere to the basic principles, because it is providing an independent assurance to the management, and hence it is important for internal auditor to be objective, to be reasonable in their assessment. They have to ensure that the data, that any confidential data is not leaked out. There are adequate checks and balances in place. And in the COVID scenario, you would have a lot of clients are asking, what is your data privacy mechanisms in place to ensure that the data is safe, secured. There is a due professional care, skills and competencies. Due professional care in terms of whether have you analyzed, evaluated data in the right spirit, have you missed out, and again some, when you look at data analytics, we obviously do a data mining to ensure that whether we are evaluating a particular control in the right spirit on the right data. Has data captured all plants, all offices, or data is missing, etc. So whether there is a due professional care which is in exercise, because basis that you will be reporting an outcome. How effectively are you relying on the work performed by the others? Now work performed by the others could be as an internal audit function, could be in terms of outsourcing it to an external party or a technical auditor or an IT auditor. So all put together, inputs taken from multiple or external third parties, as a head of internal audit, how are you relying on the work performed by them? Because ultimately the assurance to be provided to the auditor committee or board is the responsibility of the head of internal audit, the chief internal auditor. And also some of the pillars in terms of how effectively you are conducting internal audit. So whether there is adequate sets of documentation being maintained, whether you are doing an effective planning, whether there are evidence which is being archived, and is it being reported to the respective authorities or stakeholders who are critical components or critical pillars of that response of that function or the department. So this is how there are some basic principles in terms of governing or managing the internal audit. The next SIA talks about how it's more from a compliance, how well and effectively do you consider some of the statutory compliances while doing an internal audit. And that's where that's where when we spoke about engagement planning or audit universe we spoke about, it is important that the internal auditor or the function has adequate knowledge and the repository available to leverage on the statutory compliance, applicable statutory compliance for each department. So I'm pretty sure all of you, when you do an HR audit, you look at compliances to, let's say, PF, ESIC, Factories Act, Contract Labor Act, etc. So there are multiple acts within India where you leverage, and if you look at all compliances that you categorize into, if I have to categorize, it will be, let's say, a workforce related compliances, all labor related compliances, financial compliances, let's say TDS, GST, etc. There are would be secretarial compliances. Companies Act is like one of the emerging ones, or one of the key compliances as far as secretarial act is considered. There are a lot of compliances on health and safety related compliances, specifically depending on industry to industry. If you look at, let's say, food industry, hygiene standards, safety standards are extremely important. If you look at the construction industry, safety standards are extremely important. So health and safety related compliances, and there are a lot of compliances which are more of industry specific compliances, like there are some industries where the output falls under weights and measures act, etc, etc. So when we do an audit, it is important for us to be aware of what are those compliances which are applicable to this department or the processes that we are evaluating, we are reviewing it, and whether are we giving assurance to the management, are we giving adequate assurance to the management in terms of compliance is applicable to that department or processes in place. The next is, we discussed this a little bit earlier, role of role of an internal auditor in an IT environment. So as we discussed earlier, IT, from a risk assessment perspective, IT, the role of an IT auditor has been emerging in last couple of years because of the complexity with which organization is facing. And hence, if we do not have an expertise in-house, then a lot of companies are doing outsourcing it, to provide assurance to the management. So when we talk about information technology, IT general controls, configuration related controls, let's say in SAP, Oracle, or other third-party systems that the client might be using, or application related controls, etc. In the current environment, cyber security, the scope of IT auditor has enhanced in terms of business commenting on the business continuity management, cyber security, data privacy, etc. So the role of an IT auditor has been evolving, and it is important. And a lot of when I present in audit committees or board meetings, a lot of board want an assurance on the overall IT landscape, because with the complexity of a lot of ERPs in place, board does not normally get a holistic assurance, and hence if you move beyond India, a lot of in a lot of Middle East regions or US regions, there is an IT governance review as an independent area, which is a large review. In India, normally we cover during these are process reviews, etc. There's an IT governance review which is being conducted, which holistically captures all those potential IT related vulnerability or risk that we talk about. These are some of the areas or some of the basically scope items that you generally cover if you have to give an IT assurance to the management. So ITGC we spoke about. Automated controls, application controls are also part of ITGC reviews. BCM or a report on BCM is a sought after by the audit committees. Data privacy, data security is also an emerging topic that we have seen. In terms of access, SOD issues that we have normally seen across the organizations, access rights, in terms of access to data centers, password protection, etc. So all these are areas where board is looking at an increased assurance, and hence the role of IT auditor is gaining extreme prominence in last couple of years. The next SIA is on analytical procedure. So this is basically data analytics that I'm sure everyone is aware of. So how do we effectively see a lot of organizations do have challenges on the availability of data or the accuracy of data that is being maintained by the organization. So that's obviously the first concern. Assuming that there are adequate data sets in place, either from an ERP, either coming from the ERP or maintained in a manual environment in an Excel spreadsheet. So how effectively we can leverage that data and try to make meaningful conclusions on and thereby providing assurance on those respective activities or processes. So data analytics has gained a significant prominence in last couple of years. There are scenarios, if you there is a concept of continuous auditing also emerging basis the data. So for example, what is continuous auditing is, and large number of clients that we have seen or the organizations have been implementing continuous control monitoring or continuous auditing. So when we do an, let's say, a procurement audit, we do a lot of checks and balances in terms of, let's say, duplicate invoices, open purchase orders, split POs, etc. And we do that audit once in a year or once in 6 months and give assurance to the management. The concept of continuous auditing is effectively leveraging on the data available, developing scripts or using analytical software tools to give an assurance to the management on a continuous basis, or more in terms of red flags. So if there is a duplicate invoice, so normally what would happen is, let's say if a duplicate invoice has been booked, the payment is processed, let's say, in a 30 days time frame. As an internal auditor, I would come, let's say, after 6 months and then report to the management that there's a duplicate payment of, let's say, 1 lakh rupees, for example. Now the concept of continuous auditing is, the moment the invoice is booked, it gives a red flag to the management. So even before making a payment, which is after 30 days or 15 days cycle, it can potentially be prevented. Again, as I said, I'm using the word red flag because not necessarily it's an issue. Now there are certain challenges also. If the data is not maintained adequately, or the data sanctity is an issue, probably it will throw a lot of red flags. But that is something that an organization needs to manage or bring in more maturity within the organizations, A, in terms of sanctity of the data, and B, in terms of ensuring that the results coming out of the data analytics are adequate. So analytical procedures is gaining a lot more importance, and specifically if you look at it in a COVID scenario, the output is completely dependent on the analytical procedures, because we are not traveling to the sites, and hence some of the physical aspects or aesthetic aspects are getting missed out to some extent, or probably to a larger extent also, depending on industry to industry. So the output is heavily relied on the analytical procedures. Now these are some of the standards or survey that we have seen. Don't spend much time, but I just want to spend time on IA standards. So there is one standard which is 1200 series, which talks about, in exercising due professional care, internal auditors must consider the use of technology-based audit or data analytics tools. So as I said, there is a concept of quality assurance of internal audit function. You would again see this trend in large organizations within India, and definitely it's a trend which we have seen in Western world, or more developed economies, where the internal audit function needs to assess themselves on the IA standards that has been defined in-house as well, and through an external agency as well. So in-house, I believe it's once in 3 years, and through an external reporting, it's once in 5 years. So IA standards also talks about that, to achieve an effective internal audit output, we should focus on data analytics techniques, and the company should have in-house tools available to support that practice. So that's on the data analytics side. In terms of sampling, extremely critical, and I'm sure when we report an audit outcomes, a lot of people do ask, kitna sample liya tha, whether it was full assurance, partial assurance, etc. So sampling, as you would already know, it's basically in terms of when we have to test a particular transaction or you have to test a particular control, we rely on sampling. Now it could be a statistical sample, it could be a judgmental sample, it could be a haphazard sampling. Normally if you look at sampling that is being used for SOX testing for large US or for large US listed companies, they normally use randomizer, which is basically there are some portals or websites available where you would put across you would input some parameters like the population has, let's say, 1,000 results and you want 25 samples, and the randomizer will give you an outcome that pick, let's say, serial number 3, serial number 5, serial number 50, etc., and that's how you use the sample. So a lot of US based organizations which are listed where they are doing SOX testing, they use randomizer as a sample. In a lot of internal audit engagements that we do, we do an effective data analytics, and the outcomes of the data analytics or the exceptions or the red flags which are coming under data analytics, out of that a sample is being leveraged. So multiple scenarios are there. So if you look at this is a standard sample size that we adopt. So for an IFC review, for a SOX testing, even in an internal audit engagement, these are the samples. There's a sample size. Again, this depends. This is the guidance. This is not mandatory, but more or less each organization adopts this as a sampling methodology. However, having said that, so this is the theory. Okay. Having said that, what I have personally seen, a lot of organizations doing it, and coming back to this is sampling methodology or sampling frequency, not methodology, sampling frequency in the current scenario is lot based on understanding if the design of the controls is adequate. So we do understand the concept of test of design and test of operating of effectiveness. So when you're doing a walkthrough of a particular process, let's say a PR, PO, GRN, etc., you tend to understand, if the design, what are the existing controls in place? Are those system controls? Are those manual controls? And if you have a reasonable assurance on the design of the controls, and obviously you assess the design of the controls by test of 1 sample, test of 2, test of 3, etc. If you get a reasonable comfort on that the design of the control is adequate, and hence you rely on your gut feeling and then say probably you might not need to go for a 40 samples, you might be confident or content with 10 samples and still provide a reasonable assurance to the management. And it could be other way around also. When you do a process walkthrough, you believe that there are particular or certain gaps, either a system related gaps or a process related gaps, and hence you might feel the need of increasing the samples, maybe from a 15 to 30 or 30 to 50, etc. So in a lot of cases a more judgmental approach is being guided, and I'm talking more from a practical aspects perspective, specifically from an internal audit engagement perspective. If you're doing an IFC and a SOX, almost 90-95% of the companies still relies on the sampling methodology or a sampling frequency that has been defined. Obviously, if there is a deficiency or if the control fails, and depending on the risk category, you tend to increase the sample size to assess if if your control has failed on a sample of 5, if you extend the sample, the control is still failing or the control is passing. So sampling has been important in an internal audit engagement. However, the trend that we have seen is it all depends on how well the control is defined, and I've seen that internal auditor is aligning or modifying the sampling requirements based on his assessment of the design of the controls. So that's what the standards talks about as far as sampling is concerned. The next and the important part is the documentation, and I'm sure you would have heard a lot of news whenever there is a whenever there is a concern raised by the management, and some of the scandals, frauds that we have seen, as to what was internal audit doing, and the question comes is, if there is an investigation, do we have adequate sets of documentation to support our rationale or the results? So basically, audit documentation is important. A lot of companies are leveraging on tools, technologies, and updating documents in a workflow portal or an ERP. If that's not the case, even in the manual environment, it is mandatory that once you complete the obviously document needs to be maintained throughout the engagement, but once you complete the engagement, you have to ensure that all those documents are well archived, traceable for future reference, and someone has reviewed the adequacy of documentation that was created throughout the engagement. Now it is important, the documentation is also important to prove or substantiate the fact of opinion or the assurance that you have provided in the report. So tomorrow, if let's say if there is a particular observation, and if it's, let's say, a duplicate payment or any other similar observation, now the basis which we have formed an opinion, now in some cases it could be factual, or it could be data based, or in some cases it could be where you have relied on the confirmation provided by the management, because a lot of times it happens that you are not able to test because the data is not in place, and hence as one of the internal audit step or the execution step is you take confirmation from the management, and that is being archived or substantiated with your evidence. Now this could be and there are various mechanisms that needs to be adopted, like how do you ensure that documentation is complete, sufficient. You'll if you look at the third bullet point, you'll a lot of time rely on the written process, which substantiates or forms a basis or an important basis of your results or an outcomes. Whether all those working files, working papers have been reviewed as part of quality assurance review, and it should be reviewed prior to issuance of the report. Because a lot of time what happens is the quality assurance is not strong within a lot of organizations, and hence the outcomes of the exercise is compromised to some extent. So A, in terms of documentation, and B, in terms of review, is extremely important. Secondly, also, we discussed, in terms of reliance on the third party documentation. So sometimes, in a lot of cases, as in consulting firms also, when a lot of clients, when we submit the output, the clients do ask for working papers, basis review, how well the quality assurances has happened. And hence documentation is, overall important. I think these are some theory points, some of the requirements that needs to be there. Document has to be complete. It has to be done prior to closing an engagement. If you have used a judgment in forming an opinion, I think that has to clearly come out. So the documentation, and also in terms of reporting, I think it has to be made very clear whether the observation is made basis review of adequate data or the transactions, or a professional judgment has been relied in forming an opinion. For example, let's say a duplicate vendor checks should be configured in SAP. Now, this is not based on, and this recommendation, it could be based on test of vendor master data. However, the recommendation that we are providing more in terms of professional judgment or opinion, or best practices that we have seen, across other clients or other similar industries that we have operated. Again, internal audit evidence is linked to the documentation that we spoke about. More or less same in lines of, whether there is evidence which is being maintained. So as part of documentation, you could say that, or you have an RCM or an audit program in place which captures your processes or the control points that are in place, and what have you tested and what is your outcome. When you say what is your outcome, it has to be substantiated by the evidence. Now, evidence in terms of obtaining a scanned copy of a particular failure point or a control point failure, etc., it becomes crucial. So archiving of evidence is, so historically, probably 10 years back, 15 years back, when we used to do audit, we used to have like files, this box files, 2, 3, 4 box files which have been archived as an audit evidence. In the current scenario, it is being archived in the form of a soft copy in your repository folder, all the technology or the tools and technology if organization is implemented. So that's how the role of audit evidence is very important. And some of the procedures, as we were talking, if you look at inspection or an inquiry and confirmation, let's say there are some tests or some scenarios where you have to give an opinion, you may not have adequate sets of data available, and that's where you rely more on inquiry and confirmation from the auditee. Analytical review, obviously we discussed. You from an inspection perspective, you do a lot of times, physical visit inspection to understand, assess if the controls are in adequate controls are in place. You make an observation basis the review of results coming out of analytical review or test of sample transaction. And sometimes, you do a fresh computation to understand, if the particular MI is being reported, or let's say a provisions being created, if um, adequate data has been considered in arriving at that computation. So across all those, I think, evidence needs to be maintained, and which will support the results, basis which you have concluded an observation. Communication with management, one of the most I probably rate it as one of the most critical parameter. It's an intangible, a lot of times it's an intangible parameter, but one of the most critical parameter in according to me. And a lot of times I've seen internal auditors, I won't say not doing a good job, but probably miss out on some of the elements. I'll give you an example. For example, we have raised an information request tracker at the start of the engagement. Let's say first of Feb, I start an audit, raise an information request tracker. I keep getting some of the data sets available, and at the end of 1 week or 2 weeks, I raise a noise and go back to the management that we have not received the data. However, it would obviously make a prudent sense to keep informing HODs of the overall data request status which is there, etc. So the and communication could be in form of communicating on a periodic basis. What is the status on data request? What is the status on testing? Status update in terms of, where are we on the project? Are we in a position to achieve the timelines? Are there any deviation to the timelines? Let's say if you are expecting a report to be released by 31st of March, are we in a good position to release the report? Are there any roadblocks that are being faced? Roadblocks not necessarily could be in terms of unavailability of data. Roadblocks could also be in terms of unavailability of the process owners, planned leaves, unplanned leaves, etc. So currently, I was having a status update call with one of my clients last Friday, and one of the roadblocks that was cited, again, it was a US client, and one of the roadblocks that was cited as Omicron. Okay, so third phase or third wave as we call, some of the team members are ill, or even if they are not ill, their family members are ill and they have to take care of their family members, which is impacting to some extent at this moment at least, which is impacting or probably will impact our timelines or our deliverables. So that's where all these parameters are extremely important. We have to keep a clear communication in writing in terms of information request, status tracker, etc., etc. If there is a particular area or particular activity which we have not undertaken due to shortage of time, or we envisaged or we probably could not assess a particular sub process, even that has to be communicated in the form of a final report or a scope limitation, whatever is it. So a lot of time these are final elements that we have seen, internal auditor do miss out. They just focus on, let's say, 5 observations that are coming in the report, scope hai, audit team have 5 observations, recommendations, root cause, etc. But these are certain nuances that needs to be factored. Communications also in terms of opening meeting, closing meeting, factoring. How do we ensure that the inputs provided by the auditee have been clearly factored in the report and there is adequate documentation in place? There is also a concept, I'm just sharing one of the concepts. There's also a concept of disposition sheet, which means that a draft report has been submitted, let's say, by my consultant to me. I have reviewed the draft report, I have given my comments. that comments generally in our current scenario, we have versions, right? Version 2, 3, 4, and we say a final version, it's a final report. When I started my journey, there used to be a disposition sheet which captures, these are the 10 inputs, and we go back to our partner or a manager and then say, out of these 10 inputs, what has been factored in the report, what has not been factored in the report, is there any particular observation that has been dropping. So again, linked to probably a documentation evidence, but communication is a much larger umbrella bucket. And one of the, I would rate one of the key parameter, if an internal auditor is not able to successfully achieve the objectives or the outcomes, probably communication gap or ineffective communication as one of the key parameters. I think a lot of points that we have covered. I think just last bullet point that I would want to focus upon, which I'm pretty sure a lot of times internal auditor does not adopt. We have also missed out in a lot of cases, and you would have also missed out. Now, this is something that is a requirement as part of IIA standards. Let's say if you have done an audit, you have released a draft report. Okay, there's been quality assurance that has happened, and even if you have released the final report, I'm pretty sure a lot of times in each of our experience, we have come across a scenarios ke final report release kar diya. We have released the final report, and later on the auditor comes back and say, probably we gave a wrong data, or the basis which an opinion form, there was some error, or let's say even during the review or post review, sometimes you detect scenarios where the data analytics was wrong, or the working was wrong, or if you talk about in terms of continuous auditing monitoring, the scripts were wrongly coded, or if it were rightly coded, there was some bug in the system. Sometimes there are scenarios where even if a final report or a final communication has been sent in terms of your outcome, uh, even if you identify those errors or omissions, at a later stage, it is the responsibility of the internal audit function to communicate the errors to all concerned parties, because you are strongly raising as your observation, right? To the HOD, to the CEO, CFO, to the audit committee and board, that these are the concern areas. But if those concern areas are coming out of incorrect observation or incorrect data analytics, I think it is responsibility of the internal function or the chief auditor executive to report back. So that's a trend that we have, that generally I have not seen much effectively adopted by most of the organizations. So generally the issue is like, okay, ठीक है, we'll factor that in the next time, but it is important because there might be a lot of decision making. It could impact the KPI of an individual or a department, and hence it is important to go back to the management and say this is an error. The observation that was reported contains an error, and we would want to withdraw that observation or probably take some time to revisit that observation. Internal control evaluation, again linked to some of the SIAs that we mentioned, but what I would want to bring out is, when see a lot of times the management or the board of directors, when we say we are providing assurance on the internal control, they want to assess where are the gaps in place. So internal auditor normally does provides a lot of, or does focus a lot on the observation. I think it is very important to focus on the root cause of the observation as to why is a particular activity happening. Now, normally, a lot of times, we rate this root cause or the observation into three parameters. Is it a people, process, or a technology issue, right? Are the system controls not adequately designed or in place basis which this observation is happening? Is the process by which the activities are being performed, or the process owner is being performing those activities, is the process not well defined? Are those gaps? Do we need to do a business process benchmarking exercise, etc., or a re-engineering exercise? Or are the people who are managing that activity or a process or a control not adequately trained, or probably um, a, um, a, a wrong person in the right department, etc., etc.? So lot of time, apart from a plain vanilla observation, the management is looking at, or the board is looking at, giving an insight on where the issue lies. Is it a design issue? And so this was people, process, technology as one of the element or component or a parameter. On the other side, is it a design issue, or is it a operating effectiveness issue, which is what we do normally in IFC SOX. But a lot of times this is being asked in the IA report as well. So do you think that the process is not robust, is not designed well, or is it something that everything is in order, but probably the processes are still missing out? So I think when we say internal control evaluation, we normally talk about pass or a fail or an observation, but giving more insights to the management, I think it is important. Now, this internal control evaluation also talks about the rating of the observation, whether the observation is high, medium, low. There might be 3-point scale, 4-point scale, 5-point scale within the organization. A lot of times in the current scenario, obviously not exactly in the current scenario, but probably in last couple of years, the management specifically is also asking for internal control dashboard. So what they are saying is, across all the scope items that you have covered, can you rate whether the controls are good, bad, or worse? You know, and normally as an internal auditor, we always say internal auditor is an exception based reporting, but more matured organizations are asking, you know, whether there are adequate controls in place and are expecting internal auditors to report in the form of a dashboard on the efficacy of the overall internal control environment. So a lot of apart from a standard reporting, I think these are a lot of scenarios where the board senior management is expecting. ERM is obviously another subject itself altogether, but I would cover in the context of internal audit. We discussed about the risk register. You know, a lot of companies have a same base, like the risk register of coming out of an ERM is leveraged for doing a risk-based assessment planning. Depending on the complexity, companies also have an independent risk register in place and an independent risk assessment planning exercise in place. Now, how do we integrate ERM into an internal audit engagement? See, ERM exercise is basically what we discussed earlier, you know, in terms of identifying a risk, assessing the risk. Is it a high, medium, low? Are there adequate controls in place? If not, you know, what are the checks and balances needs to be there, etc. And obviously monitoring it or reviewing it on a periodic basis, reporting to the audit committee, chief or the risk management team, etc. on a quarterly basis. So that's a typical ERM process flow which you see on the right hand side. The most important is, as a chief risk officer or the risk management team does not have a bandwidth to effectively comment on the adequacy of the control environment. So as part of ERM, you do document that, for example, let's say a risk of earthquake or a risk of natural calamity. One of the control point which is documented is, you know, we have an insurance coverage in place, okay, which is fine. So that will bring the risk rating from 5 to 1 or 2. So the risk rating will subsequently come down, the impact will come down, probably the likelihood might also come down. However, is the insurance policy or a program that is being designed which the management believes that, you know, will mitigate the risk? The question is it mitigating the risk? Now I'll give you certain scenarios, certain examples. Let's say you have 10 plants, or you have 10 plants which are covered in the insurance arrangement or insurance policy document. You have started a new plant, but a lot of times, you know, we have seen scenarios where the insurance function tend to miss out in terms of in terms of incorporating that location into an insurance coverage. So simple and a classic example. So although management might believe that, you know, the risk rating is coming down because there are checks and balances, but that's not actually the reality. So ERM is a second line of defense. I'm sure you would have heard the concept of 3 lines of defense. First is the internal structure organization, which is responsible for managing the risk. The second is the risk function, you know, which identifies the risk and relies on the controls that are adopted by the management. And third line of defense is basically the internal audit functions, which will evaluate or provide assurance to the management, and also will, you know, integrate in effectively coordinate with the risk management team, because the risk rating relies on the controls that has been documented and whether the controls are effective in place. So that's the overall ERM. If there are any questions, happy to answer, but ERM is like it needs probably another 2-hour session to explain what ERM framework and everything is. But I just wanted to cover how does ERM gets integrated with the IA function. Consideration of frauds in an internal audit. One of the classic question when any scandal happens is asked is, what were internal auditor doing? Now there is all, if you go on Google and check, you know, there are a lot of discussions, debates, seminars have happened as to role of internal auditor in a fraud scenario. or a fraud. So now it's a thin line. But I have seen a lot of boards asking, internal audit kya kar raha tha, and all those things. Now, internal auditor has to play a role, has to play a very effective role in terms of identifying or helping management. Are those adequate checks, balances in place? Are those adequate controls in place to identify a potential fraud, to prevent a fraud, or to detect a fraud? So if you look at, the internal auditor should help the management. It may not be their primary responsibility, because again, it's a sampling based exercise, it's a limited review. So we are helping management to design adequate controls in place, whether they're adequate controls to detect to prevent a fraud, to detect a fraud. And so that's one part of it in terms of fraud governance management. Now the second part is, when you're doing an internal audit, you have to ensure that across all the departments or process you are reviewing, you have adequate you at least have an adequate repository or a knowledge in place as to what are potential fraud indicators across a particular department. So if I go back to the IA standards, where we see 1200 series, there is some series, I don't remember the name, but there is a requirement of documenting of fraud indicators, or a list of fraud indicators across each department. Now that is what the best practice says, and hence internal auditor needs to have a sufficient knowledge on potential fraud indicators, make a reasonable assurance, or to test the data in such a way where they are able to make a reasonable assurance or provide a reasonable assurance to the management that they have looked at fraud indicators as well, and basis the sampling that they have done, they have not identified that. So internal auditor does have an important role to play. Having said that, the way the current, when we see the frauds happening and saying it was it was the sole responsibility of internal auditor, the answer is no. But yes, they have a larger role to play in detecting or in preventing a fraud or detection. Using the work of an expert, I think this is where we have discussed in the earlier standard also, in terms of internal auditor relying on work of, let's say a technology auditor or a technical auditor, and he making an opinion. Having said that, it is important to rely on the work of others. However, the opinion formed by the chief internal auditor has to be reasonably adequate, because he is confirming to the board or audit committee that the controls are in place basis the work performed by others. So it is his responsibility to ensure that adequate checks and balances also done by him. He has done an adequate review, quality assurance before communicating to the board. So I think this is what I think we have discussed in earlier side. So I'll maybe skip few slides as far as this activity is concerned. Related parties, boards are asking. So related party audit, as you would generally see, is generally not an independent audit that is being covered, but a lot of times, maybe and more specifically, statutory auditors are asking a related party review. So today afternoon I had a call with one of my client where this has emerged as one of the audit area based on stat auditors inputs that has come. So assessment of related parties, who the related parties are, if any transactions has been entered, has been correctly disclosed. So whether has been whether from a competence perspective, has it been correctly reported, the existence of related party and the transaction that is being done, and B, it has been if there is a holistic transaction that has been correctly reported. So it's a related party transaction review, which is obviously it's critical to conclude. But again, it's an independent audit. It's a separate audit area that needs to be considered. But there are SIAs, which has come up on related party transactions. Quality assurance in internal audit. Now, this quality assurance basically I would cover in two parts. One is when you are doing an engagement, when you're reporting to the management, quality assurance for that individual engagement. I would want to spend a amount of time on quality assurance of the internal audit function, the IA standards that I spoke about. And if you look at the last line, external quality review at least once in 3 years. This is technically now changed to once in 5 years. More of internal assessment should be on an annual basis, but once in 3 years, once in 5 years needs to be assessed. Now that typically talks about, if do you have internal audit charter in place, are you maintaining adequate documentation, Is your reporting adequate, concise, clear? Everything, all those parameters that we discussed, all those SIS do get consolidated and are part of overall quality assurance of the internal audit function. This is gaining prominence in within India. EQIP review is what we generally call external quality assurance and improvement program in place, which is once in 3 years, once in 5 years. India में अभी भी till date I have seen limited exercise that is being conducted as part of quality assurance of the internal audit function. But again, if you go in the Western world or the Middle East market, this is something that is mandatory. So I am doing a quality assurance. I normally do for last 4 years. I am doing a quality assurance review of one large telecom group. Every year we pick up 3 entities, 3 countries or 3 entities to perform a quality assurance review of the internal audit function and report to the group. So that's an emerging trend. We are in India, it is still in nascent stage. I'm not saying no company does it, but few companies are doing the external quality assurance. Internal assessment, IPPF. So IPPF is a framework or a guidance note basis which serves as a guidance as to how the internal audit function should be executing its engagement. So again, it is recommended, it is not mandatory. So IPPF stands for International Professional Practices Framework. Basically, it's part of IA. It's a standard issued by IIA. This is external assessment that I spoke about, getting it done from an external party and commenting on some of the standards. Internal audit reporting, the report has to be, see, I think what is more important is in terms of, apart from language and everything, I think it has to state facts very clearly. The opinion has to come out very clearly. A lot of times I have personally seen, even when my consultants write a report, they try to make it too fancy, in terms of English language, but the more you write, the more complex you make. It has to be crisp, factual, and your opinion, whether your opinion is based on a judgment or a transaction, has to come out very clearly, and the root causing of it has to be clearly reflected. So I think these are 4 or 5 components needs to be taken care as far as reporting is concerned. Then I think everything falls in place. There's from a reporting perspective, there's a lot of internal guidelines in place. And again, are you relying? Is it your work, or are you relying on a third-party judgment? And it has to clearly reflect a departmental dashboard or a process dashboard. So, like if a particular activities has been happening in a good manner, or there are no checks, no controls or adequate controls in place, I think that opinion has to get clearly reflected. So again, report writing is something like an independent session that we can have, probably 1 or 2 or 3 hour session. But the standards does focus upon both SIA standards, and even if I have to comment on IA standards, I think report writing is important, and also sharing practical experiences of meeting senior management or the board. A lot of times they are happy with the quality of the observations. They are not happy with the way the observations are clearly brought out. So sometimes it takes a more of a theoretical shape. I think this is just a illustration, what generally falls as a components of the IA report. Distribution list, what is the period of coverage. Most important is one of the scope limitation. I think I covered in one of the slides. I think scope limitation has to clearly come out. If there is a particular activity, particular sub process that you have not been able to review because of a lack of time, because of unavailability of the data, I think that has to clearly come out. A lot of clients are a lot of times, when I've seen the audit report, it does not clearly bring out the executive summary. So executive summary, it should be like a theme. So if you have, let's say, 10 observation in a report, when I look at executive summary of 1 pager, 2 pager, it again brings the title of the observation. So if I am the management, I am the CFO, I'll tell you, in one of the board meeting, what happened. I was presenting, let's say, a 5-slide report, 5-slide PPT. One of the audit committee chairman did ask me to shut down the presentation and asked me to define the overall outcomes in 2 minutes. And that's where, honestly, I struggled. And that's where I was talking more in terms of transactions. Your release strategy not configured in PO, your X not happening, there are duplicate invoices. And the audit committee chairman asked me to summarize as to how do I see the overall governance environment or the cover or a control environment in the across a particular department or a process. And that's where I realized the importance of executive summary. You have to talk more in terms of themes as to where we see a challenge. For example, if a release strategy has not been configured in a PO, PO series is not coming automatically, there are manual inputs XYZ. I think you have to bucket it at and then say there are overall weak controls noted in a PO management, or a configuration or a purchase order configuration SAP needs to be revamped, needs to be strengthened, etc. So executive summary, 1 or 2 slides, does give a context to the management, because lot of management is almost the entire management, like CFO, CEOs are not interested in reading like a 20 slide observations. They are more focused on giving visibility or inputs in 2 to 3 slides. Action taken report, follow-up report, or we call it implementation review, action taken report, follow-up report. So if we have been doing audit for a particular department function over a period of time, we have done it a couple of years back, we have done it last year, the management is expecting as to whatever outcomes or observation that were reported in the previous year have been implemented as of now. Otherwise there is no point in doing audits year on year basis if the old observations or old action plans have not been remediated. So this is something that it's an important area, or board of directors and audit committee are asking a one-pager dashboard on the overall implementation status. And the nature of assurance, I think this is already we have discussed, whether you are looking at internal auditor does provide a reasonable assurance, limited assurance, or a full assurance. Obviously it's a test of samples and everything, but with the continuous control monitoring, with a lot of focus on data analytics, risk-based IA planning, slowly that there is a thin line between a reasonable assurance and a full assurance. I'm not saying it is full assurance as of now, but yes, the management is asking us, rather than relying on 10 samples, 20 samples, to cover our analysis or assurance to the extent possible on a full data, like doing a data analytics on a holistic manner. That's it from my side. Just wanted to spend some time on some of the slides which are crucial, but if you believe there is any questions at this moment, or anything that if I've skipped some specific slides in at a greater speed, happy to answer any questions that you have. Any question from anyone so far?
There was one chat which was shared into this group about whether internal auditor can help into that one of the fraud which was said, that there are many false calls being made on behalf of the insurance companies, and in which customers are losing their money. So there was one chat going on between our group. So one of the members has asked that what internal auditor can do into that. So I also had some views on that, but what do you think as an internal auditor, what can be done by the internal auditor?
So see, ultimately internal auditor is responsible for commenting on the control environment. So the thing that internal auditor can do, see, sometimes, as I said, sometimes it's a if the primary focus of internal auditor is more in terms of fraud prevention, right? And ensuring there are adequate policies, procedures in place. Or they are not responsible to document the policies and procedures, but at least guide management that your existing policy needs revamp or enhancement, etc. So from a fraud prevention perspective as well. So they are responsible in building the control environment. Having said that, on a practicality basis, whenever some fraud happens, I have seen that almost in 90% cases, the board of directors will say that involve internal auditors as well. Now, not in terms of putting an onus on the internal audit. So a lot of time, what happens whenever there's a fraud, the discussion starts as to internal audit kya kar raha tha, या उस internal audit की responsibility थी. I think it should be more focused towards let's relook at a control environment if there is anything that missed out. So internal auditor should be a party along with, let's say, CFO or any departmental head where the fraud has happened. Internal audit is supposed to comment on the control environment. Whatever has happened to ensure that it does not happen in the future. What are the checks and balances that can be implemented? Now it could be in terms of, let's say, strengthening your SAP or Oracle. It could be in terms of implementing an additional maker checker manual controls to prevent such kind of a scenario. Having said that, some companies are vulnerable to frauds and frauds will happen. Like ऐसा कोई company है जहाँ पर fraud नहीं होता, right? Now, unfortunately, a lot of times when we say fraud, we related it with the number, a financial number, paisa, right? I'll tell you, in one of the audit committee, and then this scenario I'm talking about 2009, almost 12-13 years back, where we were doing a scrap management review for one of my manufacturing client, and they had something called SLR, which is called scrap performance management, something like that. The term which was used, but basically they were issuing a dashboard to the management, including the CEO, on a monthly basis as to what is their scrap reporting. So what is the quantum of scrap they are generating. We did an entire review on the production line, पूरा एक रेकी मैप किया, there's an assembly line, step 1 कितना scrap होता है, step 2 कितना scrap होता है. And when we matched with the actual records, we found that the production team or supply chain team, whoever was responsible, were under reporting. So scrap was actually probably 5%, 10%, and they were reporting to management ke 0.5%, 1%. Now this is when we reported. We did not say in terms of fraud. We said that there is a deviation between what is reported to you and what is the actual scenario. So we normally do a mismatch and then we say gaps in reporting. That's where CEO stood up and say, "Okay, boss, it's a reporting fraud." And that's where I also realized that normally we correlate fraud with a financial number, कि इतना पैसा गया. But that is not necessarily, obviously it is true, but CEOs and the boards are also looking from a financial reporting fraud, from an accounting fraud. It's very important. So scrap is one of the smallest example, right? हम लोग कभी scrap को angle से देखेंगे नहीं, but for that MD it was very crucial. So
yeah, that's correct. One of the feedback which I gave was on that even the dealing with the customer's complaint can be an area which can give a clue that what type of fraud may be being done. Sometimes it may not affect your operation, but it can affect your reputation, and people, your customer can get impacted that if I take the insurance from this company, it can result into a loss to me. So that was the point which I wanted to communicate into that group. Yeah.
True, definitely. Yeah. See, I'll tell you, that's where I mentioned about the risk-based IA planning exercise, right? Now, earlier customer service as an audit area used to get clubbed under sales management. It's one of the sub areas, साथ में कर लो types का, where we have seen largely for service sector. Now this is emerging an independent area as well. So again, this is part of the risk-based IA planning exercise. You break it down into parts and then say this is critical area. Maybe customer complaints in 2008, 2010, 2015 were much lesser, but the customer complaints have increased significantly in 2019 and 20. Now that's where when we do a risk-based IA planning exercise, I think it has to be flagged to the audit committee board that because the percentage of customer complaints have increased from 1% to 5% or a potential 10%, it calls for doing an internal audit, and hence the risk-based IA planning exercise has to be at least an annual or probably could be half yearly as well.
Good, thanks a lot.
Yeah, Kabra sir, I just also wanted to add something with respect to the group. What you are saying at the insurance fraud of 50 crores, what I only put up in the WhatsApp group. So what we also do as an add-on, we also take into consideration the social media group and what are the data security perspective. So this has been happened last year itself. I can correlate it with Airtel company organization because it was also published in social media. So in Powai, our chartered accountancy firm was there, and internet connectivity has got lost. And by using an Airtel, so the maintenance guy has called up for a KYC option, and almost 40,000 rupees has been debited. And afterwards, after 2 weeks afterwards, so the CEO of the Airtel organization in Economic Times, it was said, so depending, so it has to be an havoc. It has to be based on the social media group. What are the emerging trends and roles? So on a self evaluation, we also can conduct the audit. Okay, these are the major risks what we can able to identify, like a social media emerging risk, what the insurance company does makes a fraud by calling up. So Jamtara, just a Netflix, may if you have seen it, it is an open platform, so they do call up a dummy call. So yeah, we also take on our own self, and we can tell to the management these are the emerging kind of the frauds. So I totally agree what you have written in the WhatsApp group, and we also in our organization take into consideration, although it is not there in the audit plan. So these are the emerging and these are the customer risks. So we do consider. Great.
Thanks.
Hope
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
yeah, thanks. Thank you, Sachin ji. Anything more? Something more? Wanted to add something? More questions? Thank you, Sachin ji, for such a wonderful presentation and giving your valuable time. I really learned a lot about the disposal sheet, the operational, the design processing apps, and various how to correlate with the SIA and along with the IA standards or IPP. What you have said. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for participating and enriching. Thank you everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ram sir. How are you? Hope all well. He is not well. Okay, thanks. Oh, okay, okay, Ram. Okay, take care. My best wishes. Thanks.